we're going to get serious for a moment here now, and just no, hang on. Don't get up. No. You read on the agenda that we're going to talk about governance, and you said, well, maybe a good time to get a snack, or I'll go to the bathroom or extend this break or something. But that would be wrong, because although I have sat through some governance presentations that the PowerPoint, the binders, the documents, the endless discussions of who owns the data. Yeah, that's some people's governance. But it's not what it's about. Governance is not a contest to find out who owns or controls data. It's an active process about how we understand, how we care for, and how we manage what we say is our greatest asset, our data. You cannot get, and I think we've agreed on that today, you cannot get or sustain results without governance. You can't manage and you can't protect your data. And with the growth in privacy, security, compliance legislation, you desperately need to know how to work within those rules for your own sake, and for the sake of your company, and for the sake of the people who have entrusted you with their data. Now, to paraphrase the first Spider-Man movie, with great potential comes great responsibility. So open your mind a little and check out the next presentation on great governance and why it matters. Our speaker is Carter Cousineau. She's the Vice President Data Model and Governance for Thomson Reuters. So welcome, Carter.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for having me. The mic works, which is a good step. Perfect. So let's kick it off. Demystifying your data. And I am going to branch off a little bit. We do live at Thomson Reuters in the Head of Data and Analytics org. So we are a fun group, I'd like to think, and hopefully in the next 25 minutes around governance and ethics, I can be able to speak to some of that for both data and models, AI, machine learning, and then unleashing the whole purpose of today's presentation, unleashing those analytics with the information that you'll need and want to gather through governance. So let's kick it off with the first slide. A few fun facts. I'd be remiss if I didn't start with some data of our own, which is data-driven organizations take 6 times more likely to retain their customers. When you put actually artificial intelligence, it has been expected to increase professional workers' output by 10%. And the most innovative companies are 2.4 times more profitable. And these are some old stats here that we have from McKinsey, and I'm sure they've recently changed. But we know the value of data and analytics. And now the question becomes, how do we instill that, right? So I won't go over every bullet point here, but a few really key points. I heard from previous presenters, data really is strategic assets. That is the value and bones of our decision making and how we come to our decisions more and more in terms of organizational structures and decision makings. 5 million businesses are actively using WhatsApp to connect with customers who engage in about 65 billion messages daily. So it's beyond a part of our everyday lives. I think if our phones were to crash for a split second, our hands are tied. We're lost for words. We're lost for our next moves. So it really is a part of our everyday. And as Jim kind of mentioned, don't think of governance as the bogged down policies and standards and endless meetings, because it's not. It's not at all, actually. If you were to think of it something from an operational sense, so let's take marketing as an example. Marketing has to create a standard guideline and or principles on how to do successful, consistent branding. And once they have that, and that's where I say that's the beginning of governance, you do want those bones, that structure around policies, standards, and templates, but as soon as you have that consistency for consistent use is then when you can start to unleash the true power of governance in terms of how that fits in your organization and being agile to those ever-growing changes, and we'll go over some. Another example I did want to touch on around governance in terms of those core fundamentals before we jump to some examples around trust, and I should caveat by saying governance to me, ethics as well, I'll be speaking a lot to. Ethics is a part of the governance lifecycle for data and models. So both extremely valuable and critical to any business. But the first question I want to ask is, do you trust your data? And this is a loaded question. Here are some of the things, the preliminary questions you would want to look at when considering, do you trust your data? What is it? What is the data I'm looking at? For some organizations, you may very well know what that is. In others, we're just scratching the surface. We're not even sure what this looks like. We're not sure who it was collected for and why, but we're just about to unleash those purposes. In more mature establishments, they know their data, and they know their data very well. Why was the data collected in the first place? I love that question. Why it was collected in the first place is a really important one. When you look at past governance now, and more moving into the operational needs of your data, all of your secondary uses. So though it may have been collected for a specific purpose, there's probably far more other uses of that data, and I'm going to be touching on that throughout the presentation because I think it's an important one. What consents do you have in place? How do you know the data has been added, changed, or filtered and deleted? These are all of the changes that happen in your data lifecycle to ensure that you have the right accurate quality of data to go about making some of those decisions for the analytics and AI systems you'd like to build. Good data in AI has the ability to solve problems. I actually want to emphasize this, has the ability to help solve problems. And here's the example I wanted to pull here. COVID, our recent times have changed a lot of the ways of working. And by ways of working, it's changed a lot of our human behaviors as well. So during the pandemic, it changed how criminals hide their cash. And AI tools were trying to sniff that out. So here's an example of using AI for good. It's hard to assess the exact scale of the problem, but in the recent study that was done by MIT Technology Review, the criminals found a new way to launder their money. And this equates to about 2 to 5% of global GDP rate. So if you want to talk about value for a second, that's a lot back for the global GDP rate. That's about $800 billion to $2 trillion at current figures, ebbs and flows, that is laundered every single year. So they built an AI model to help forecast and identify some of the fraud detection in advance of that occurring. So though criminals found a new way to launder their money during the pandemic, at the same time, building AI machine learning has proven to be a societal benefit. Now the biggest question, and some of the examples I always like to pull. On the flip side, what happens if ethics is not considered in the AI system lifecycle? We'll go over the trolley problem here, which is commonly known as the ethical dilemma. This study was done by MIT Technology Group back in 2020 when it was published, but in the MIT lab in 2014. And it really brings back that ethical dilemma of should the driverless car kill the baby or the elder? The answer is no one, of course. But when you're facing those decisions as a human, how would you behave? So they created this gamified view to better understand humans' decision-making process in that very question. What we found is that, or what MIT lab found in 2014 is that the answer depends on where you're from. So those in Asian countries selected the elder, or more frequently were to select the elder, and those in North American countries selected the baby. The reason why this is such a big question or important ethical dilemma is that when you actually feed that data into your self-driverless vehicle, how would it behave, right? And you can see just right in the study of human behaviors, how depending on the countries or jurisdictions you're in, that behavior may be different. The decision of that model or data set for the self-driverless vehicle would be different. So there are cultural differences within our society, and we cannot neglect those. So we have to ensure our data and models and systems are fair, because that is the data that's fed into them. Another example I like to pull up, which is pretty common in terms of HR processes. So HR recruitment AI tools found gender bias in their processes. I do want to emphasize or pause here for a second that this problem actually has happened amongst several different occasions in terms of automated recruitment tooling, and it really stems back from an ethical concern. It's the historical and gender biases that were found in the system. So they were found to more frequently hire men than women. Hand sanitizer, this is a unique one. In the first versions of the hand sanitizer was not found to recognize all hands. So this is a classic or one of the image recognition problems that's been found in research. So the collection of pool of images may not have represented all hands that are to society. So many ethical untrustworthy problems stem from the data itself. This is kind of why I like to pull from some of the past examples we've learned and seen in society as a whole. The data that we collect and use is only as good as the data that we have in our models. So having that fair overall representation across the model itself is where you hear a lot of that mentality of garbage in, garbage out, couldn't be further from the truth. having quality data, valuable data, that is where your models and your analytics will really start to be unleashed. You'll really start to understand the sorts of data you're looking at doing. However, in many instances, the system was built with good intentions, but those checks and balances may not have been in place to properly embed throughout the data lifecycle and model lifecycle. So these are some really important factors when we look at extending past and using our data for different uses, especially those secondary uses. Two other quick examples is the credit card. So credit card score ratings or mortgage scores, they were found still similar and bias challenge that irrespective of the fact that you may have had a higher credit scored rating, the data that was collected and used had an unfair representation in terms of the scoring it would give amongst gender. Another piece here that I'm going to jump over is the AI in healthcare. Now, this is a big bucket of opportunity, but at the same time, you don't see the full adoption. And the question becomes, why? Despite, and the example I often like to give is the advanced research that we've seen in cancer treatments rates. So we know that there is technologies around AI that can detect cancer rates far quicker and easier than that of doctors. Why aren't they adopting? This pulls in the ethical issue or example around explainability where doctors cannot take that technology unless they fully trust it. They need to be able to trust that technology 100%, nor they will not adopt. So that's something where even though we've seen advancements, you don't actually see that curve and shift in terms of actual adoption. So there's a few examples around ethical considerations. And again, I do have to say that ethics is a part of governance, so at both of the life cycles. Now let's talk a little bit about the policy landscape globally and what we're seeing. I'll go through a couple of examples of the current landscape. In Canada, we have what is called the Canadian Directive of Automated Decision-Making in force since 2020. We also have the Canadian Artificial Intelligence and Data Act pending since 2022. When you go in and move into the states, you see different regulation that's more at the state level. So I'll just call out a couple, but New York state law on regulating the use of artificial intelligence employment decision enters the workforce in 2023. Illinois has their own, and California has unique transparency acts. If we move down to LATAM, you see they have a different regulatory environment, Brazil, Mexico, and then in APAC, we have Singapore and Australia with their unique AI acts. The reason I want to call this out, and I think it's really important, is if you look at the history of privacy, we're at that same trajectory around ethics. So privacy had a lot of different regulations that were forming in different geographic locations and regions. Of course, I neglected to mention, but GDPR is one in Europe. So we see the landscape coming around ethics. We know these ethical concepts are being established from a regulatory standpoint, but they may not be speaking commonly to one another. And that's similar to what we saw in privacy till it reached that final convergence. From a policy landscape, I expect the same trajectory. We'll see this divide or slight variance between regulation from country and jurisdiction to the point it reaches that convergence, and that will be that go forward from a global. But right now, as it stands, regulations aren't formally speaking to one another as closely tied as they could be. Now, I heard previous speakers speak a little bit about PII, so I won't go in too much detail here, but these are some of the fields in terms of personal data, PII, or also commonly known as, and then sensitive fields that may be in your organization to watch out and look out for. I want to talk about the second part of this. So you have your PII classifications and personal data tagged. Awesome, that's fantastic. In a centralized view, data cataloging, your AI registry, any register centralized view for your data and models. So you have that. What I think and what most organizations are going to have to go into, and this is where I say it moves past the governance check and balance and moves into your operational effectiveness, is what else do you need to know about your data? Classifying your data aside from PII, right? So now consider from a geographic location. You'll know selfishly from my perspective, it's great. We'll know exactly where the data is being pulled from, where it's being used, and we can in turn pull that report and be able to know exactly where our data is being used should regulation come around. So meet any compliance need and you're ready to go, But on the flip side, I'm referring more from the actual operational sense. So if we're looking at our products, we're looking at our marketing, we want to know where it's used and how it's used. And if you have that line of sight, this is where you'll start to open opportunities, and your opportunities will flourish even further. The build one, use many mentality of actually, you know you've built it in this one organization. You know that type of model worked for your sales group. Why not actually take some of those parameters and build it across different verticals of your organization? So classifying your data to the degree that your organization would need it to inform your decision making is really, really critical. And it saves some of the work, which I'll go over towards the tail end. Another piece I wanted to touch on is explainability. And I talked a little bit from the healthcare sector where you could see this adoption rate really be dependent on that of being able to trust the data. From the explainability realm, there's a ton of different techniques, but it really does stem back to the type of AI machine learning model you used and the way you built out that model on the techniques you could have in place. So I won't go over them, but models can be built, of course, through image recognition, tabular data, and text, unstructured or structured. So logistical regression models, decision-making, neural networks, natural language processing, these are all AI machine learning techniques that have actual explainability means and techniques that could be done and have in place for your models. Last but never least, my nice little video to give me some sound effect behind me. Governance has a ton of components to it, some of which I've went over at a high level: classification, tagging, ensuring your data catalog is centralized, as well as your AI registry, having access to that data, test data, being able to monitor your data, monitor your models. It's important to note that governance and the concept of enterprise-wide fits under two buckets here. So you see the first one that's more of that regulatory requirements. There's a regulatory need, but then there's a flip side, which I call proactive governance. Though there might not be a regulatory need, there is reasons for your organization to have those checks and balances in place. So to be ready for those ever-growing changes. Now, what's your role in governance? We all have a role to play. The Data and Model Stewardship Network is really what fosters and brings together your subject matter experts to the table to help solve those data and model issues and identify them early on. Let's focus on model governance for a second. So that's your AI machine learning side of the house. Have you ever had a model developer who has all the subject matter expertise of your model and has left the organization? How much more work is it now to be able to take that model and drive it forward, move it forward? There's so many gaps and blanks within just understanding that model because your data scientist has left. That's the value of something that seems so small or as simple as an AI registry, but actually having that line of sight for all of your models in your organization. More organically, when you move into the operating model, being able to take what you know for your data and your models and drive it forward. So good data governance really does have the ability to drive better products and solve and improve customer experiences. That's it for me.
All right. Let me get on up here. Thank you so much. I love the music. That was so cool. That was good in there. So the practicality of governance in there and how you make that work. When you go and talk to people around your company, was I exaggerating? Do you get the reaction, oh God, governance in there?
You're not wrong. It depends. It depends on any organization. I think the biggest piece, and it was kind of pulling in the previous talk actually, is where you're at organizationally in terms of educating. And educating is key. Yeah. Inconsistent use of some of these terms and just providing that consistency at the organizational level goes leaps and bounds, because once they've established that, they know the value, they see it. It supersedes actually the needs of a governance team, and operationally you become more sound.
Yeah, if you start talking about the things they're interested in. Funny how that works, isn't it? Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you.
Great, thanks.